Welcome into Discern. Today is Monday, December 27th. I'm Ross, joined again by special guest contributor Kerby Anderson. Welcome in, Kerby.
It's good to be with you. Looking forward to this conversation.
Kerby, it's great to have you. Kerby's the host of the radio show Point of View. On the last episode with Kerby, we unpacked what's going on with the Supreme Court and some critical rulings that they're making around the issue of religious liberty, religious exemptions. And today we're actually going to get into some economic topics. I remember for me growing up, you know, Alan Greenspan was this figure in economics class that had all the controls and that we needed to pay a lot of attention to. But frankly, economics was just a difficult topic for me in school. And so I'm really grateful to have you here, Kerby, to help us unpack and understand what's happening in the landscape as we get some news on the Federal Reserve today. So this is from CNBC. The Federal Reserve provided multiple indications Wednesday, and that was December 15th, that its run of ultra-easy policy since the beginning of the COVID pandemic is coming to a close, making aggressive policy moves in response to rising inflation. For one, the central bank said it will accelerate the reduction of its monthly bond purchases. The Fed will be buying $60 billion of bonds each month starting in January, half the level prior to the November taper and $30 billion less than it had been buying in December. The Fed was tapering by $15 billion a month in November, doubled that in December, then will accelerate the reduction further come 2022. So there's a lot of words in there, Kerby. You know, as I said earlier, economics not my greatest subject in school. Can you just help give some context on what all this means?
Well, Ross, first of all, let me hopefully not scare people away. When we talk about Federal Reserve, I think a lot of people go, oh, well, I don't have any interest in that. But yet the Federal Reserve does affect your life. I had somebody on my radio show a while back say that the most important person in the world is the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And I thought that was a pretty outstanding statement until we began to look at how the Federal Reserve can determine what interest rates are, how much money is printed, and the rest. I know we're going to also do a future session with you on the whole issue of inflation, so I'll get to that later. But let's recognize that the Federal Reserve right now is trying to address some very significant issues. And that is, if you go back to a time in the 1970s, we went off the gold standard in 1971, and because of a variety of other things, we were spending money on both guns and butter. We had a Vietnam War, we had a number of other things. We had massive inflation in the 1970s. Some of the viewers that have gray hair or no hair at all will remember that time, but our younger listeners never have experienced that. We will be, and then maybe the next episode, talking about how the consumer price index right now is as high as it's been since 1982. And since we measure that differently, it's actually higher than any time, even in the 1970s. So what's going on? Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve has a real difficulty because we spend more than we take in. And because of that, really since 1971, if you plot out, and I've shown these graphs before, the gross domestic product, and then look at our actual indebtedness, there's a gap, and that gap has to be made up in some way by borrowing. Well, the way you borrow is you issue things like treasury notes and bonds and the rest. And in the past, Americans would buy those, even people in other countries would buy those, but now nobody wants to buy those. So what happens ultimately is that the Federal Reserve has to buy them with money that's created, which leads to our next session that we'll talk about in terms of inflation. And so they've had to buy more and more of those by creating more and more money. So a very significant date is in the 2008, you had the housing crisis. And from 2009 on, we've been printing more and more money. Then we had the pandemic and the lockdown, and you look at the amount of money that has been printed, and it almost goes vertical. And so you've had a situation which we are being, in a sense, inflating the money. The dollars in your pocket, the dollars in your wallet, the dollars in your purse are going to be worth a lot less next year or even tomorrow than they are today because we are inflating that. Well, the Federal Reserve finally sat down and said, you know, we need to start tapering the amount of bonds that we are buying. And so that is called tapering. Now, what we sometimes have had in the past is when the Federal Reserve says, well, I'm going to have to taper the kind of purchases we make. That's called tapering, and they call it a taper tantrum because ultimately the stock market goes, wait a minute, you can't stop buying these. And so this is one of the real interesting things that's come from the Federal Reserve. You might say, well, again, that's all sorts of government stuff. What does that mean to me? Well, first of all, it means that, and I don't claim to be a certified financial planner, but it does mean to me that, first of all, it's going to be buying fewer of those treasuries. That means it's probably going to see the stock market not go up as much as it's been going up right now. If you have money in an IRA or a 401k or in the stock market directly, you want to pay attention to that issue. Number two, it also still says they aren't stopping to buy those, and so inflation will continue in the future. So you're going to find that the prices of what you buy when you go into a grocery store or what you go into a department store or when you pay your rent or your mortgage, some of those will go up unless they're, of course, fixed by a loan. So that's going to be a concern. And second of all, how does that affect you? Well, it's going to affect the stock market. And I'll make a prediction, Ross, that before it's all through, that taper tantrum will happen again. And they'll start saying, okay, right now we got our foot on the brake. We're going to have to take our foot off the brake and put it on the accelerator. And so we are in for kind of a tumultuous economic time. And so even though a lot of us that didn't really want to pay attention in economics classes about the Federal Reserve, we're going to be affected by some of these policies. And so even though it's easy for us to say, I'm not going to pay any attention to the Federal Reserve, they're going to affect you and your family in ways that you probably would never have imagined.
Yeah, that's a helpful breakdown. Really, since I want to say for me, college, you look at the stock market, and I was raised that it will go up most likely, but there's these big waves of up and down. But if you look at the last 10 years, you just don't see it. I mean, we've just enjoyed this period of really steady growth. Now, obviously, COVID did its thing, but look at the correction from that. If you look at the 10-year picture, it's still just kind of a blip. And if I find myself wondering, okay, when is that going to change?
Well, and I think you're asking a very good question because, like you said, I can show you some ups and downs on various stocks. And I can show you, for example, that in this case, the stock market always goes up. Now, part of that is due to the fact that the stock market and those people that are investing are closer to the money printer, so they have benefited from that. So if you plot out the increase in what's called the M2 money supply and the increase in the stock market, that's the case. But again, as you just implied, what goes up certainly eventually is going to come down. It may come down fairly quickly. Right now, if you look at the stock market and in year end, while we're talking about this, they may say, well, the S&P 500 looks pretty good. Yes, but if you look at certain stocks, like the momentum stocks, they've already taken a dive. So what's going to happen next year? Well, I guess it's everyone's estimate and everyone's prediction, but I do believe that you have to be a little bit more wise and recognize that it is wise from a biblical point of view to have diversity, because even in the book of Ecclesiastes, it talks about dividing your resources in multiple ways. And as a matter of fact, I've written whole books on biblical views on money and economics and the rest, because I'm convinced that this is going to be, Ross, one of the biggest issues. Our talk show for years has talked about politics. We've talked about apologetics, theology, but we have concluded that we need to talk more about this issue of the economy because of some of the things that are being done right now, which are economically unsustainable. And so I think it's more important than ever before that we begin to think biblically about our money, about our finances, about our giving and the rest, because we're going to be coming into a much more uncertain future in 2022. And so that's why I'm so grateful that you asked me some of these questions today.
Well, and really a big goal of this show is to take topics that are immediately interesting maybe to some people, and then maybe take a few topics that are like, that seems either distant or maybe not connected to my day-to-day, but also bring it home to know actually these do matter, and here's the biblical reason they matter. And I love that you brought up the reference to something we've hit on a couple weeks ago pretty heavily, is just stewardship. So when we think about our resources and how to be wise with our money, we really can't, and most people don't, but I sometimes do. We can't really shut our ears to some of the what may seem mundane details of the financial landscape, because they absolutely affect our future. And so we want to be plugged into what's happening. And that's why it's super helpful to have you to kind of help us translate some of these terms, because some of these articles can get dense and use terms that, I just frankly don't fully understand.
So again, those are one of the reasons why we're covering some of these today. And again, it's important to recognize that we should do what we can to maybe get ourselves out of debt, because after all, the scriptures are very clear in saying that if you are in debt, you're almost like a slave. Proverbs talks about that. So the first step is to get out of debt. Number two, I would say that if you are out of debt, to make sure you have some kind of savings. Maybe, again, we have different people on our program that say, at least 1, 2, 3 months of savings for that. And number three, get some advice. If economics or finances is not your structure or not your ability, not something that you understand only so well, whether it's a Christian financial concepts or a variety of others that have been over the years talking about this, Crown Financial and many others, get some advice even from those organizations or from a trusted person in your church, because we are going to be in a time where I think it's going to be very crucial for us to think biblically about our money, about our finances, about our giving, and as you said, our stewardship. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so thrilled that you made this possible for us today.
Well, I appreciate those practical steps. And as we close, one observation that I've seen, you mentioned, getting out of debt, consider starting with a certain amount of savings and then getting advice. Sometimes I've found that third one may be necessary to kind of help you get 1 and 2 into place, because those things maybe seem simple on the surface, but to actually do that, sometimes having some help is critical. And so definitely encourage people to not be scared to ask for help. And again, something we hit on this show, sometimes it's just going, I do actually need help in that area, and find that trusted person or organization that could do that. So Kerby, very helpful. We're going to hit a little more on inflation in tomorrow's episode. What happens when I go to the grocery store and things are just more expensive? Why is that happening? So we'll be unpacking that. So we will see everybody back here for that tomorrow on Discern.